Hi everyone. As we're just going to wait 1 or 2 minutes to let other people join in. It would be great if you could just tell us your Harvard affiliation and where you're logging in from. I'm going to start with me logging in from Meghalaya in India. Great, thank you. I think just in the interest of getting started, I will start in another minute. Um, and it's great that we've got someone from the Philippines joining. Okay, great. I'm just going to start, and hopefully more folks will join in as we begin. So, welcome everyone to today's webinar hosted by the Harvard Alumni for Climate and the Environment, or HACE. I'm Smriti. I lead the Asia function. We're trying to do more events in the Asia time zone. HACE is an independent volunteer run shared interest group affiliated with the Harvard Alumni Association. Um, while we're waiting for a few others to join, Michelle, who is our co-president, will paste a few links in the chat right now if you want more information around HACE and how to join it. If you are not already a member, I'd highly encourage you to just take a look at the links and see if you'd like to join our network and stay connected for our upcoming events. HACE operates with three pillars in mind. The first one is community. We're here to connect the global Harvard alumni community that is interested in climate and environment. The second pillar is action, where we're trying to facilitate opportunities in partnership with other shared interest groups at Harvard to learn, set up your own ventures, and collaborate with others in the action to, act in the climate and environment space. And then the third is that we want to cultivate knowledge and introduce new ideas and perspectives to our communities. So, keeping the third pillar in mind, I want to introduce you to our speaker today, Dr. Christine Webb. So, Dr. Christine Webb also comes from our alma mater. She's a broadly trained primatologist at Harvard's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology with an expertise in social behavior, cognition, and emotion. She's currently the assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Studies at New York University, and her research is driven by a growing awareness that the ecological crisis demands a profound shift in how we understand other animals and our place amongst them, which has led to two intersecting lines of inquiry. The first is she investigates how animals manage and mitigate social disruptions, the emotional and motivational states that underlie those processes, and the cultural influences shaping them. And the second is she's interested in how prevailing societal norms, values, and institutions shape contemporary scientific knowledge of other animals and the environment. Her book, The Arrogant Ape, was a New York Times notable book of the year and is currently being translated into 17 languages. Um, Michelle will put in some links about her book and her website in general, and you're welcome to take a look. I'm extremely excited about this conversation. So, the idea is to spend about 35 minutes chatting with Christine about the themes of her book, and then we want to open it up for audience questions. So, please participate and feel free to either drop your questions in the chat through the talk or use the raise hand function when the Q&A starts. So, thank you for joining us today, Dr. Webb, and a warm welcome from the Harvard community.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So I'm going to jump right in. I want to start with the provocative book title. My friend had picked it up in January and she devoured it almost immediately and then was like, you need to read this book. So my first question to you is, what inspired you to write this and then also call it The Arrogant Ape?
The title was actually my mom's idea, and I will get back to that in a moment. But what inspired me to write this book was a growing mismatch between our knowledge of anthropogenic disturbance, human behavior affecting the planet, causing climate change, and our actions to do something about it. I was having this growing sense amongst colleagues that more data, more knowledge doesn't seem to be the ticket here, because the gap is only widening, and that gap between awareness and action should lead us to think about fundamentals, to question the underlying worldview and relationship and story that we tell about ourselves. And I, at the time, was in Harvard's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, which is a department centered on this question of what makes us human.
Right.
And it was an experience that answers to that question often emphasized things like our unique ingenuity and virtuosity and intelligence and capability. And I knew I wanted to tell another side of the story. So I was texting with my mom. I want to talk about humans and what we're doing to the environment, taking an evolutionary approach, thinking about how we relate to other forms of life. And she just said, "How about the arrogant ape?" And I said, "That's it. That's what I'm going to name the class. And it might be a book too." And my experience, I taught that course for 5 years, at least in the department. And it was further validation that these ideas were hitting a nerve, and I saw how it transformed my students' way of being in the world and my own to engage with these ideas that we'll get into. And that really motivated me to try to write a book for that's trying to reach a wider audience.
Right. Thanks so much for that. So, I mean, you've already touched upon the theme of, human exceptionalism. And so for the audience, could you elaborate even more what it means and how it's tied to the weird thing that you keep mentioning in the book and like what that stands for? Because I think when we're thinking about that's the culture we've all come from, and like why do you think that's super important in dismantling to kind of think about the ecological crisis?
Yeah. So the subtitle of the book is The Myth of Human Exceptionalism and Why It Matters. And by human exceptionalism, I mean this belief that humans are somehow separate from and superior to the rest of nature. And it's interesting because I was actually in conversation with a couple colleagues yesterday. In science, when we say something is a myth, we mean that it's a falsehood, that it's untrue.
Right.
Yet people in the humanities use myth rather differently. Myth is not something that is a falsehood, but it's actually a collectively lived belief system. Maybe it's unconscious, but that structures reality and that shapes reality. And actually in the book, what I'm trying to do is approach human exceptionalism in both senses of the word myth. So I'm trained as a primatologist, as a
Yeah.
scientist in evolutionary sciences, and I'm making the argument that has been made before, frankly, that human exceptionalism is false from an evolutionary point of view, because all species stem from common origins, and the differences amongst us are a matter of degree and not kind. And so I use a lot of Darwinian thinking and logic in the book to show continuity among species, not just in physicality, but also in the constitution of our minds, in our
Yeah.
intelligence, in our consciousness, and our psychology. So I'm approaching the myth of human exceptionalism that way and debunking it. But I'm also showing how human exceptionalism operates as this collectively lived worldview, and that it
Yeah.
kind of is instantiated and reified by the way in which it is so enmeshed in our lives. We are swimming in it. I say that it's the most powerful unspoken belief of our time,
Yeah.
because it's so ubiquitous that we often don't question it. It's kind of
Yeah.
normalized, and we don't even realize all of the ways in which we subscribe to it. Um, and so I wanted to again take kind of the word myth in both of these senses, and that's what I'm doing in the book. But then I just wanted to mention that when it comes to the ecological crisis, we're so often focused on these visible causes like fossil fuels or overpopulation or biodiversity loss, and rarely are we questioning or naming the underlying cosmology or narrative that makes these other exploitative systems possible. And like I was saying before, I really wanted to start to question that invisible narrative and worldview, because much of human exceptionalism's power is drawn from its invisibility. All of these other causes of the ecological crisis get named and identified and studied, where
Yeah.
human exceptionalism doesn't, and it doesn't get scrutinized. And in that way, it derives more power. And again, that's why I say it's the most powerful unspoken belief of our time. So I wanted to expose it to
Yeah.
people, and yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what you refer to as weird and like people
Yes.
who,
Oh,
yeah.
thank you. I wrote that down and then I forgot to get to it. So WEIRD is an acronym, picture all uppercase letters, that stands for Western Educated Industrialized Rich Democrats. It is a term coined actually by Joe Henrich, a cultural anthropologist in my former department at Harvard, to highlight the fact that the vast majority of what we know about human psychology comes from weird cultures or weird populations, who are weird because they're highly unrepresentative of humanity on the whole. And yet they're often taken as the benchmark for all sorts of psychological processes. Um, and what I mean by that is that most psychology research is coming out of institutions like universities, where the participants are students, undergrads, or the children of professors. And so the vast majority of them are weird. They're Western educated, industrialized, rich Democrat. Uh, and and so this is a very important theme in the book for a couple of reasons. One being that I don't believe that the human exceptionalism as a collectively lived worldview is a human universal. It's not something that is true across all human cultures, past and present.
Right.
The product of, maybe we could say, the dominant culture, or like Western industrialized culture. And then I often refer to weird in the book when I'm talking about how the bias of human exceptionalism has seeped into science, in the way that we study ourselves and other forms of life, in the benchmarks for intelligence or mindedness that we set as a standard to compare all other beings against. And so maybe we'll get into that a bit, but
Yeah.
that's another. Weird is a very useful concept in the book.
Yeah. No, I think maybe it an example right now would be useful for people to understand how it seeps into scientific knowledge or like the
Yeah,
production of, yeah.
sure. So I'm a primatologist, and I will share an example from my own field, which has focused primarily on social cognition, as you said in the introduction, how they navigate the complex challenges and rewards of living in a social group and how they relate to one another. So in comparative cognition, we're comparing the cognitive abilities of across species. And typically, comparative cognition research will compare the cognitive abilities of humans to those of our closest living primate relatives. So let's say chimpanzees. We're equally related to chimpanzees and bonobos, but chimpanzees
Yeah.
are more often the subjects of these studies. In those studies, which might be comparing social cognitive capacities like empathy or cooperation, pro-social behavior, how often individuals help one another, you're typically comparing the performance of fully autonomous, weird human beings
Hmm.
with the performance of captive chimpanzees who live in highly deprived social and physical environments. You're separating them, the chimpanzees, from the group during testing. Often they've been separated from their biological mothers from birth. You're giving them human tasks and materials like plastic puzzle boxes and computer touchscreens. Maybe some of you have seen some of these studies reported. Um, they're having to understand the cues and communication of human experimenters. Whereas the children in the study, they typically, or the humans in the study, they're often children. Maybe sometimes they're adults, but they come into the lab for the day. They have their caregiver in the room. They're in
Yeah.
communication with a human experimenter. They're given human tasks and materials. So in so many ways, neither sample is representative of the population that they are meant to represent. The chimpanzees are
Right.
highly unrepresentative of chimpanzees on the whole because they're living in these highly restricted man-made environments.
Yeah.
And the human beings, as I said before, are highly unrepresentative of humanity on the whole. And
Yeah.
yet results from those studies are used to draw these very broad conclusions about species differences in
Right.
social cognition or cooperation. Most
Right.
often, it won't be a surprise to you probably, but most often those studies will show that the humans, the children or the adults are much more cooperative than the chimpanzee counterparts. But it's really stacking the deck
Yeah.
against the chimpanzees from the start. And that is one way in which human exceptionalism has infiltrated the sciences. And not only does it create ethical problems,
Yeah.
as you can imagine, but it limits the science and it doesn't lead to good science either. And those two things go hand in hand, I think, more often than we like to assume.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. I think that like really drives home the point of like how much we bought into this idea that because we do better than the chimpanzee, or not even us, like some child does better than the chimpanzee, that we're exceptional. So I mean, to talk about weird, right? So all of us have been trained by Western education systems. So when and a lot of us are recognizing now that there is so much in indigenous knowledge and local ecological knowledge that we could learn from and like respect. But how do you actually do justice to that in practice is something that like I'm curious, and I'm sure like people in the audience are curious to know. Like how do you actually bridge that divide, because there is such deep training and conditioning that we've all been subjected to, that how do we actually get there?
Yeah, I'm navigating this myself at the moment. I had an interesting journey and experience writing this book because so much of what I'm doing is trying to imagine a science and a world beyond human exceptionalism. And what the science beyond human exceptionalism would entail, it would mean foregrounding ethics. It would mean taking the subjective perspective of, let's say, the animals, but you could apply this to many other forms of life, but the animals you're working with, taking your own subjectivity seriously as a researcher, foregrounding trusting, mutually accommodating relationships. I mean, in science, we're told not to empathize or engage with our study systems lest we tamper with the data. And I and many other colleagues are sort of arguing the opposite, that no, we actually do need to be empathizing because these are living beings with interior
Mm.
worlds, lives. And I mean, there's a long history in anthropology of having to learn this the hard way too. Like you actually have to gain trust, embed yourself within these human cultures in order to be able to learn from them. And I think the same can be said of other forms of life. And so all of these things that I feel like are sort of at the edges, the frontiers of where science is going. And then I realized I read this book called Native Science by a Tewa scholar named Gregory Kahiti. And it's all core to indigenous ways of knowing. Basically, everything that I just said is
Yeah.
they're fundamental like tenets of indigenous sciences and ways of knowing other animals in the environment more generally. So it was this kind of humbling realization, okay, that none of this is so cutting edge and new. It's all very
Yeah.
old. One of my favorite anecdotes just along on these lines is that, Jane Goodall, the
Yeah.
late great Jane Goodall, who is an incredible idol of mine, she is typically credited with discovering things like chimpanzee tool use and cooperative hunting. But of course, indigenous African communities knew about these behaviors and reported them to European colonists hundreds of years prior. Uh,
Right.
and and so there's just so much that we think of as being revolutionary in the science, but that is clearly much older and deeper. And then the question of how to bridge these ways of knowing. I mean, one is that neither is a monolith. Like Western science is not one unified entity. We have a National Academy of Sciences that has like 50 separate subdivisions connected to biology alone. And there are
Yeah.
different methodologies and different norms and different questions and approaches in each of these different sciences. And the same could be said for indigenous sciences too. They're not unified. There's so much heterogeneity. So there might be more kind of internal differentiation than between
Yeah.
differences between the two. Uh,
Yeah.
but but I will say that one of the most helpful and informative approaches is this concept called two-eyed seeing. I don't know if I wrote about it a bit in the book, but the
Yeah.
whole idea is that when we're talking about Western sciences and indigenous sciences together, we shouldn't be trying to use one to validate the
Yeah.
other.
Yeah.
Robin Wall Kimmerer, the Anishinaabe botanist, she talks about how we shouldn't be blending indigenous and Western science. Instead, we should think about weaving them together. And two-eyed seeing is a useful metaphor for this because each of our eyes takes a slightly different view of the world.
Yeah.
And together they allow us to see the world more clearly. But we don't want each one of our eyes to have the same exact perspective because then we wouldn't be able to see things so clearly. So it's not about um, using one form of knowledge to verify the other. The bridge is more about recognizing both as being valid,
Yeah.
um, not ranking them, and 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 celebrating that diversity as opposed to trying to like assimilate one.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So, to the book, you map this brilliant emotional, cognitive lives of species ranging from like chimpanzees to, mushrooms and fungi. Can you share one or two of your favorite examples that you think like we could learn from, really? And I know you're a primatologist, so I'm sure one of the examples is going to come from there. But
Yeah. Um, I'll share one example that kind of allows me to speak a bit further about how human exceptionalism has seeped into science, which is how
sure.
we've tested for self-awareness in other animals, which has conventionally been through what we call the mirror task. You
Right.
effectively will surreptitiously place a mark on a subject's body and then present them with a mirror. And then you see, okay, do they orient towards the mark? Do they try to remove the mark? And human children pass this test most of the time around like 3 years of age. Most other primates pass the test. Gorillas, interestingly, don't, but that's because they perceive direct eye contact as a threat. But most
Right.
primates will pass this test. And yet, dogs and wolves have notoriously failed at the mirror self recognition task. And it's not just primates who've passed, like dolphins have passed, I think goats have passed. And so, anybody who's fortunate to live with a dog might be
Yeah.
thinking, well, just because my dog wouldn't recognize themselves in a mirror doesn't mean they're self aware. And we have to think beyond the human or the primate centric sensory world and think about how dogs and wolves engage with the world, which is not, they're not visually dominant like primates. They
Right.
navigate the world primarily through their sense of smell. They have an extraordinary sense of smell. And so researchers finally caught on to this bias in the self awareness research and then devised a task that tapped into the dogs and the
Right.
wolves' sensory experience. And so they effectively did an olfactory mirror task where they gave participants a can that contained either their own odor, so their own pee, or a can in which the containing an odor that had been slightly modified. And of
Right.
course, dogs and wolves could differentiate between the olfactory mirror or of
Right.
themselves
Yeah.
and one that had been altered. And so, in this sense, they exhibit a kind of self awareness. Now, I use this example because it just highlights the this idea of the Umwelt, the kind of sensory world that an organism inhabits, and how there are species who are capable of doing of feats that are incredible. I mean, I'm thinking right now about owls who have um, amazing. I mean, birds of prey in general have amazing sight. And when I was living in Namibia, I was living in this little tent, and there was an owl who slept above the tent. And every morning, before, like the moments before I would wake up, I know that I would kind of start to like twitch a little bit. And I would open my eyes. And the second I opened my eyes, the owl would stare down and look at
Wow.
me. And the owl knew that I was awake before I did because they sensed
Yeah.
changes. They could see probably, the little flickers or yeah, twitches in my eyes. And owls can also hear the heartbeat of a rodent on the forest floor, like 30 or 40 feet away from them.
Oh, wow.
And and this helps them hunt in low and dim light conditions. But now when I'm out walking and I hear an owl, I'm always thinking, well, they can hear my heartbeat right now. I mean, that's an incredibly
Yeah.
beautiful and humbling thing to notice or to imagine that owls know our heartbeats and maybe then even have a really good sense of our mood and our
Yeah.
emotion, whether we're afraid or calm. Um, so I love examples like that just show that sort of other animals have these superpowers in their
Yeah.
sensory and navigational abilities that even the finest human instruments like can't actually capture so readily. And I guess another example that I'll just throw in there would have to do with slime molds, these like soil dwelling amoeba who researchers have put in mazes, and they grow towards food sources. So if you put like a little oat flake in a maze, they'll grow towards it. And they've done a lot of studies to see how they grow and what routes they choose to go through the maze. And they always take the most efficient route by far. And in fact, you can like put an entire map of a city like Tokyo, and they'll find the most efficient route through it way
Wow.
faster than
Yeah.
even the fastest human supercomputers. Like they figure out the most efficient solution well faster than any of our own technologies can do. And so, and there's endless examples like this. And I had so much fun exploring them in the book and getting to dive deeper into a lot of them.
Yeah. So as a policy student, I'm going to throw a question at you around the policy world, which is now there's so much conversation around like carbon markets, payment for ecosystem services, as ways to kind of grapple with the ecological crisis. Um, do you think is this enough of a shift in the mindset we need to move away from human exceptionalism? Like, what is your general thought on monetizing nature?
Yeah, I recently had to give I had to give a talk where I was thinking about how to really move beyond human exceptionalism in practice. And I admit, like, it would involve major structural overhauls of so many of our institutions, of our economic systems, as you're saying, but
Yeah,
also of our education systems, of our food systems, of our legal systems, which divide the world into subjects, human beings, basically, and
yeah,
things, everything else,
yeah.
which is property, except for corporations and ships, which also count as persons,
Right.
but tellingly.
Yeah,
Um, and and so we would really need, and I think these changes are already happening, in to some extent in each one of these sectors. So that's encouraging, but I don't think change in just one is enough. I think we need to be pushing for a less anthropocentric approach in all of them. And
yeah,
then at the same time, I believe the change needs to come from the top down and also from the bottom up. I
right.
believe that individual choices and actions matter, and that I have started doing some things in my own life that change my orientation with the rest of nature. And it might come down to something as simple and yet profound as the language we use every day when we talk about other forms of life. So it's so common, especially in science, to use these like impersonal pronouns to talk about nature, that maple tree is an it, and
Right.
that dog or cat, maybe our companion animals, those are the few that we reserve, these sort of names and identities and personal personalities for. But, I've started to use personal pronouns when I can, instead of using
Yeah,
terms like pork or beef or
yeah,
seafood. I use
yeah,
words like pigs and cows and, trout or salmon. And I'm not going to use words that instrumentalize or commodify nature. I mean, even these very common terms in environmental studies and science, like natural resources and ecosystem services and carbon
yeah,
markets, to some sense, they really are like commodifying nature. There's alternatives. We could talk about our lifelines and our neighbors, and
yeah,
our relatives. There are so many other ways of thinking about and talking about, I should say, other forms of life that are beyond this sort of commodified lens. And that's just one of the kind of, I think, things that we can do in our everyday lives. In addition, the last thing I'll say is I've been thinking a lot about how cultural change actually happens, and I
yeah,
and I do think it happens in conversations in communities like these, and giving each other permission to imagine a different way of life and to imagine a different economy and legal system and food system and education system. And that if we can't imagine it, it's never going to happen. And so that sort of imaginative
yeah.
step is actually a really practical and important first step. And I think that's part of what you guys are doing, and what we're doing here.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that. So I'm now going to put us in the space of imagination, Christine, where let's imagine you're in charge of setting the agenda on how to work through the ecological crisis for the world. Um, what are the top three things that you set about doing? And I'm not putting a money constraint or a time constraint or anything to it, but like, what do you think are the three things we should do first?
Um, I think our food systems would be one of my top priorities because the scale, the scope of suffering, I mean, we're talking about billions and billions of animals per year.
Yeah,
Uh, Also, there's a lot of human suffering. involved, not to mention the ecological footprint. And there's something about, our food system, there's like a material relationship, a material practice that when we're consuming other animals casually in situations where their lives are not at all honored or good, that kind of reinforces a particular kind of supremacy or relationship that is just not coming out of our own hearts and belief systems, but coming out of the practices that we're engaging in casually because they're so normalized all around us. So I would say food systems are a big one. I think a lot about pedagogy and how there have been a lot of studies looking at, again, coming back to this idea that human exceptionalism is not a human universal. It's not something that humans all around the world subscribe to, nor is it the lens that young children, even in weird societies, come into the world wearing.
Yeah.
So they've done a number of studies in weird cultures, particularly looking at, okay, do young children prioritize humans over other animals to and to the same extent that adults do? So I'll share like one of my favorite studies really quickly and then get back to some of the other priorities. But in one of my favorite studies, researchers would place where they would give participants American, let's say, even though the study's been done in several cultures, but American children and adults with moral dilemma scenarios that pitted varying numbers of humans against varying numbers of either dogs or pigs. Essentially, it's like there are two sinking ships that contain different numbers of human or other animal passengers, and then participants have to choose one boat to save, and they're told, okay, the dogs or pigs or humans on board, like they can't swim, so whichever boat you save, those will survive, and whichever boat you don't choose, they will all die. And whereas adults, American adults, will always prioritize even just one human over even 100 dogs or pigs, American children often opted to save one dog over one human, or certainly two dogs over one human. They valued the life of a human being and a dog far more similarly than did the adults. And I'm just sharing this because it's evidence that the sense that humans are morally special is not an inborn bias. It's something that is socially acquired. And the authors of that study argue that it's acquired as children kind of enter mainstream society and education and learn how other people around them are kind of exploiting other forms of life. And so how can our pedagogies be rethought so that they are encouraging children to hold on to what they already know to be true about the world, which is that other forms of life matter and they're not here for our exclusive use. So that would be a huge priority for me. I mean, spending so much more time outside. There's that famous statistic about how American children can name like 1,000 corporate logos, but they can't tell you the name of 10 animal or plant species living in their own backyards. It's like I would want to rethink that. That would be another big priority. And then third, as is already happening, I think these rights of nature movements that are happening. This is getting to our legal system as a third priority, especially when those movements are done in collaboration with indigenous communities and ways of knowing. I think are an incredibly promising way forward for thinking about how to counter human exceptionalism, understand the intrinsic value of the rest of nature, and advocate for protections and sort of the agency of like the personhood movement, which is actually not just about protecting, but like endowing other forms of life with a sense of agency and a moral voice in the ethical conversation, I think is another important one.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for that. I mean, it's very different from what I thought would be on the
Oh
list.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, just it is about where we started from and what we studied, right? At some level, like how we think about prioritizing. So
Yeah.
this was super interesting. And just to close our conversation before we open it up to the audience, I see some comments on chat. Is I mean, the scale of what's happening in the ecological crisis is like really overwhelming to a lot of us, and I mean, there's a lot to feel despondent about. But what's the one thing that gives you hope that humanity can kind of outgrow its arrogance?
Um, I think the humility of not knowing, of uncertainty is so crucial here. I absolutely understand that despondent sense. And I would say, in the book, I write a little bit about this when I talk about optimism and pessimism, and how I favor neither, because optimism and pessimism are both very probabilistic. They say, okay, like we know what's happening and we understand what the odds are of a better or worse future. And instead I align myself more with hope, as your question is focused on, because hope is more about uncertainty. It's more aligned with humility, and so that is actually what gives me hope, the sense that we don't understand how everything works, and and that's not to say that I'm optimistic at all, but that
Right.
I reserve this sense of possibility, just from kind of a humble standpoint of not knowing. And then I will say, just because the semester at NYU last week drew to a close, and I got to teach a class there called The Arrogant Ape, the same one I taught at Harvard all those years. And it's been incredible to me, now, I think, having taught it 6 times. Every time it's a different journey and experience, and the students' transformations, and the kind of microculture that we create in the classroom, that is really about like going beyond all of these norms of human exceptionalism. Like we start speaking differently, and give each other permission to have very different values and beliefs, and seeing how that can emerge even throughout the course of one semester. Like it can happen
Right.
so quickly. And I think it's because moving beyond human exceptionalism is tapping into a much older and deeper and truer and more authentic way of being in the world. And that's why I think there's already some momentum on our side. The way that we're living now is not how humans have lived for most of evolutionary history. And so I think that also gives me some hope, is seeing how these ideas resonate with younger audiences,
Yeah.
um, and gain traction quite quickly.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. I think now we're ready to open it up to the audience. If anyone wants to raise their hand and ask a question, that would be great.
Betsy?
Yeah, Betsy, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, I want to bring a little different perspective as a div school graduate, and I, I, I haven't read the book yet. It's on my list, but I did read the interview in the little daily news thing that came out, and I quoted you in a little talk I gave at Appleton Chapel, um, because that was there. I'm a minister for Earth Justice at Old Cambridge Baptist Church, and they joke there that I never preach out of any text except the first 3 chapters of Genesis, because it's all there.
Mhm.
Um, and so weird. I didn't hear that in Weird. I mean, Weird was weird and wonderful. I mean, in a lot of ways, but one of the reasons I ended up in divinity school was um, that patriarchy is in the first 3 chapters too, and I was there with a cohort of eco-feminists who were going to undo all of that, by relooking at our traditions. Um, and so I just wanted to put that out there. And I was noticing there's a lot of reference to the indigenous traditions, and that's going on in spiritual in more progressive interfaith communities as well, with land acknowledgements. And I just got back from a thing in Maine 3 days last week with a whole bunch of congregations and some Wabanaki folks talking about their traditions, which are, I think the beauty of them is that they are both scientific and spiritual at the same time. So that understanding of the kinship and the entanglement, which is a scientific thing too, the entanglement of all reality and the interdependence of all reality is a sacred thing. And that's really in all of the other traditions, but it's been decentered. And so anyway, I'm just saying, I don't think we're going to get there until we address that. I mean, because there's this whole group of folks that are, reading things literally on the right and who can't get past the human dominion in the first chapter of Genesis, or the male dominion in the third chapter. So yeah, I'd love to see that included in this conversation going forward. Yeah. But it's amazing, and I loved, as I said, I loved and quoted you in my little talk at the chapel. So yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing it into the conversation as it should be. I write a good bit about the Judeo-Christian tradition and this infamous passage in Genesis that man has dominion over all the beings on the earth in the book, and happy to talk a bit about it here. One is that I'm emphasizing also how human exceptionalism has seeped into the sciences, but as we know, Western science, and we don't really like to believe this, but if you go back, it has many roots in Western religious traditions too. We like to think of them as totally, secular and separate, but the great chain of being, this whole notion of a hierarchy of beings with humans at the top, will only surpassed by gods and angels and spirits, and a ranking of the biological world just below them. We think that Darwinian theory kind of dispelled that, but actually there's so much hierarchical thinking even within Western science. We often talk about higher and lower animals, for instance. I mean, that is ladder thinking that is not consistent with evolutionary logic. And I was recently listening to a conversation, I forget who, but they actually referred to, it's this is getting at your point about the almost separation of spirituality and science, at least within the Western tradition. And this person said something about the materialist priesthood of modern science. And I was like, oh, I love that's such an interest, because I actually think that you could say that Western science is spiritual in the sense that it is subscribing to a very particular kind of cosmology, which is materialist. It's materialism.
Right.
It's this whole,
right.
And that, consciousness, well, as long as we just put billions of more dollars and energy into understanding how consciousness arises from the brain, even though we've been doing that for decades and have made very little progress in understanding how qualitative experiences arise from material or physical substrates. It's like, that is a very particular kind of worldview that science has not managed to escape. And I like this notion that it's like the materialist priesthood of science, because again, it shows that science has a kind of like a metaphysics and a belief system that maybe it doesn't often admit to have. And
then it's posited as a kind of religion over against the false myths.
Yes.
But some of us know that those myths are there's different kinds of truth, that they're not literal. But
exactly.
And the other one thing I wanted to throw out is the the roots of Christianity or in Judaism, but it very early on went into the Greek world, and that's where it got the dualism.
Yes.
But right. The roots, the Judaism is not a dualistic religion. It's patriarchal and hierarchical, but it's not dualistic. So there's more room to work with that tradition to recover. And there's a ton of nature religion in the Bible, but we just skate over it.
Totally. I mean,
that's
I've
another whole
actually,
conversation. That's another.
yes, there's like animist almost
Yes.
rereadings of the Bible. And I try to make that point carefully in the book, that it's not necessarily like the Judeo-Christian religion, again, which is not a monolith, just like science is not a monolith, but the dominant reading of those passages that you mentioned. It's the dominant reading. And it's but there have always been countercultural thinkers. I mean, St. Francis among them, and that we, again, I think human exceptionalism has always used the powerful institutions, like, and at one point that was the church, maybe now it's science. Arguably today, it could still be the church too, as you were saying, but has always been the kind of view or value system of a dominant minority within those traditions and texts. There's also a million
because it's the theology of dominance. So
of hierarchy.
They like to be dominant. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for your question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great, Francisco, and I think this will probably be our only other question.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Webb. This is an amazing conversation. I'm really looking forward to reading your book. So I wanted to talk about gender equality. So I've recently read a study about how much more socially altruistic behavior is exhibited by, for example, female squirrels compared to like male counterparts. When a predator comes, when they see a hawk, they call out and they warn the whole group, but at the risk of themselves being cut by the hawk, right? So kind of like social suicide to save, like individual suicide to save the group. So like as a weird man from Brazil, championing gender equality, but still living in a very patriarchal, male-dominated society, I was wondering how much of that male domination you think is purely learned and cultural and passed on by societal norms and rules and religion and like all that, and how much actually has potentially deeper biology sources to it, has deeper roots that are shared among with other species, perhaps. So like I read something about rodents. So like I'm sure somewhere in between there's some kind of lessons that we can kind of draw from that, because if it does have biology roots in it, it could be an even harder problem for us to solve, not as a way to excuse men from doing what they do, but it's not just a conversation. I think that maybe we have to do even more to achieve something that if there are any roots on biology, how can we fight those things at the gene side instead of just having the conversations?
Thank you for that question. Could you share the squirrel paper in the chat about altruism? And I mean, I would love to see that.
So I'll look into that. I don't know if I have the link right now.
Okay. Yeah. If you find it at some point, please do share. So yes, it's funny because when I talk about the arrogant ape, everyone's like, so who is the arrogant ape? And I'm like, it's not a species-wide characteristic, nor do I even necessarily say that it's a culturally universal one, because again, even throughout Western history, there have always been countercultural thinkers and traditions. So I refer to the arrogant ape in the book as a hubristic perpetrator in like a Greek tragedy. Like the arrogant ape is a character, and there's a script that it's a cultural script and way of being that we've inherited. It's a role that we inhabit. And yet often when I'm talking about the arrogant ape, I will say he, and it will just slip in there. And I've been trying so hard not to gender this character. But of course, I mean, in the tradition of Greek tragedies, the hubristic perpetrator was often male, or was always male, rather, I should say. So I think I have not fully managed to escape these gendered assumptions, which I do think they're not just assumptions. I think they're realities. And your question about to what extent is it culturally determined versus biological, I couldn't dream of putting a number on that at all. What proportion is biological and what is learned? But I would absolutely agree that it's an interplay, and that there is certainly a sex difference that you could look at across species that would be, driven by certain hormones like testosterone, and that those things to some extent are biologically, and I don't want to use the word determined, because as you rightly acknowledge, just because there's a biological basis for some behavior doesn't mean that it's inevitable. It means that it, as you said, it might be harder to surmount, but first and foremost, we have to identify it and recognize that it's there and understand it. And that is actually how we then can use cultural norms and conversations and taboos, or whatever we want to call it, to sort of shape and keep those biases and those problems that might emerge for, I think as Betsy was saying, the patriarchal values that might be in conversation with these biological differences. We can keep those in check more. And then as a primatologist, I always have to point to bonobos as a great example of a way in which there can be systems of power that, even if males are biologically larger and stronger than females, that female alliances can have a power of their own to sort of keep aggressive, misbehaving males in check. So when we talk about our closest living relatives, we're often so focused on chimpanzees, and they're like the archetype of a more patriarchal society, and bonobos are the archetype of a more matriarchal society, and we have to think about both as being a part of our human story. It's not just one or the other. And then the last thing I'll say, I know we only have a minute, but some of my research right now is looking at cultural variation within and across chimpanzee and bonobo communities, and showing that we have, again, these stereotypes about, okay, bonobos are female dominated, tolerant and peaceful, and chimpanzees are male dominated and despotic and aggressive. And actually variation within the species is often more pronounced than variation between the species. So there are some groups of chimpanzees who act far more bonobo-like, and some groups of bonobos who act far more chimpanzee-like. And I think this really speaks to the possibility of cultural forces being able to interact with biological ones to shape them in ways that we could imagine wanting to move more towards, if we want to move towards a more egalitarian and peaceful society. So I guess maybe that would be, if I have to put a number on it, I would give a little bit more weight to the cultural forces than the biological ones, but both are certainly at play. Thank you.
Well, I think we're at the close now. So really want to thank you, Christine, for making the time to speak to us today, and for everyone who showed up to this. I hope you, the ones who haven't read it already, are feeling inspired to read it. And HACE is looking for volunteers and co-leads to kind of expand sessions we can organize for other time zones. So if any of you are interested, please look at the link and reach out to us. Thanks so much, Christine, for your time.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.